So coming to you again in the name of the another episode of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast, where what I want to do this time, subsequent to our first foray into this field, where we talked about the World Health Organization document for benchmarks in osteopathic training, I want to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to do a lot of gear shifting as I go through the development of this podcast and the sharing of ideas and the sharing of lenses to digest ideas and maybe consider the value that they have, the value that they don't have, where they're strong, where they're weak. So I don't necessarily want to say simple, but what I feel like saying simple, but it may not necessarily be the best way to say this. The concept that I want to discuss here is how the term faith is extremely important to any endeavor for learning, for knowledge, or for building on what has already existed. So to just share, so some will be able to consume this with video, some will not be able to consume this with video. So I'm going to share my screen here for the benefit of those who are able to see the visual representation. The definition of faith that you're going to get from Google really quickly is twofold, right? So the first thing that's going to pop up, it's apparently from the Oxford Dictionary. Number one is complete trust or confidence in someone or something. Number two is a strong belief in God or in the doctrines of a religion based on spiritual apprehension rather than proof. Okay, so I'm going to move down the page a little bit to bring something else into this, because the aim here is to generate what I would call a synthetic or a synthesized definition from multiple pieces of information to pull a larger idea together. So we're looking for the overlapping things, the things that are similar. Right, so if I go down a little bit, you get Merriam-Webster, strong belief or trust. I have faith in our leaders, belief in God, system of religious beliefs, religious people of all faiths. It's spelled a little funny. I'm just looking at the Google hit. I'm not looking at the actual definition. I haven't gone to the page. Confidence or trust in a person or thing, faith in another's ability, belief that is not based on proof. Had he had faith that the hypothesis would be blah, blah, blah. The things that are consistent is confidence or trust in something else, and the concept in belief that is not based on faith, or belief that is not based on proof, I think is the most fair way to say that. So the manner in which I often synthesize this is faith is essentially a belief in something that you cannot currently observe or identify. So that would apply reasonably well, say, to faith in a friend. You cannot observe right now that they're going to do the thing that you think they're going to do, but you believe that they will. You have confidence that they will do a predictable thing, or the thing that you predict. How does this apply to knowledge generally, or science, or osteopathy? So I'll start with science. In order to pose a scientific question, you're going to form that as a hypothesis, but you're doing it because of things that have already existed, or you've already come across, or you've already observed. So you have to make the assumption that things that you've already read were built in ways that are worth your confidence, worth trusting. You have to have some way to figure out that the claims made based on previous experimentation is valid, that it is what it says it is. So you have to have faith that those things were done the way they said they were done in order to build your new question. Now, your new question is essentially formed with the basic underlying assumption that you can identify an answer to the question you're asking. You can't see the answer right now. You have to assume, or you have to believe without proof, that the question can be answered. Now, there are ways to build a scientific question that we're not necessarily going to touch on right now, but the very basic concept is that your question has to be built in a way that it can be disproven, right? So you have to be able to prove it false, or else it's an untestable question. Then the way you build your experiment has to be in a way that, should your prediction be wrong, it should be visible. So you actually have to test your question or test your hypothesis, test your prediction, you got to try to break it. But the thing that's consistent there with the definition of faith and the ability or the steps to build a scientific question or scientific hypothesis is that you have to believe that you can answer or you can observe the answer to the question you're posing. So I can, at least in my synthetic definition of faith, suggest that that belief in something that isn't currently observed or maybe currently observable, you have to believe that it can be observed, that it can be identified. So I would say that at least it relates well to the concept of faith. You can give arguments that that's not necessarily faith because there's proof prior, but you have to have faith that the proof that was built prior was done as it said it was done, because sometimes there's funny business and sometimes it isn't. So how does this relate to my discussion of the World Health Organization benchmarks for training in osteopathy? Well, if you see that as a valuable document, you have to have faith that it was done for the reasons it was said it was done. You have to have faith that the recommendations are based on best practices for educating osteopathic practitioners or any healthcare practitioner. Now, I've given reason, or I've given an argument why maybe that isn't the case. Maybe the WHO benchmarks for training an osteopathy document isn't what it says it is. It isn't based on best information. It wasn't based on the best information of competency-based medical education, or really competency by design, or a competency framework that was well known when it was released. It's based on contact hours. So it's essentially invalid on its face on that level, as I already discussed. For you to use the WHO document, you have to have faith that everything that went before it is what it says it is. Now, you can argue with me and say that utilizing the WHO is a form of proof. It is proof that that is the best way you should educate people. But as I discussed in my previous podcast, it's not based on that. So your faith is and the proof that you're using to guide your building of a program or guide your attempts to educate osteopathic practitioners is, although you believe it's based on proof, the proof is actually not top level. It is not observably consistently good for producing osteopathic practitioners. It will probably produce solid osteopathic practitioners, but there's better ways to do it. So it's not the best. It's not what it says it is. It's not necessarily as valid as it could be. So this relates well to the concept that I brought forth with faith in science and faith in, at least the WHO document. You have to believe, or you have to assume that it is what it says it is, that it is valid. In the case of the WHO benchmarks for training in osteopathy, it is not entirely what it says it is, right? It also isn't necessarily directly a WHO document. The WHO teamed up with the regional government of Lombardy after the regional government of Lombardy already started that project. So the WHO essentially just scabbed it, right? They just kind of pulled it from a small context and put it into a larger context. Although there were international experts involved in the WHO document or the development of that document for benchmarks in osteopathic training, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were anything more than subject matter experts in osteopathy. They're not necessarily education experts, as I already touched on. So that's kind of repetitively poking at a point that may not have as much value for some. But the general conversation primarily being that if your proof, or the thing that you take as proof, doesn't have the qualities that it pretends, or that it purports to carry, then your proof is weak. Your proof is not what you hope it would be. This is not necessarily just to pick at one thing. I'm just using the WHO document for benchmarks in training in osteopathy as an example this time. But this concept of believing that something that you can't currently observe can be considered faith, right? So you have to believe that in order to pose a question, and in order to attempt to learn something new, in order to pose a scientific question. right? You don't have proof that your question can be answered, but you have reason to believe based on previous proof, but you have to trust that previous proof. So I would also call that a form of faith because it's confidence in something that is not you. That confidence should ideally be tempered, especially with growing knowledge over time. So that applies relatively well to osteopathy as a profession because there's a lot of things that osteopathic practitioners have faith in that they believe as confidence in something that is not them, such as previous information or previous practitioners, where they place a lot of weight on those previous pieces of knowledge. They assume that they are what they say they are. And a lot of them, when we scratch at them a little bit, they're not what they say they are. So the claims of certain osteopathic methods or osteopathic schools of thought, right? So say something such as cranial, craniosacral, visceral, essentially anything that talks about bioenergetics, they are not what they say they are as far as mechanistic claims. So cerebrospinous fluid isn't something that's necessarily palpable in a living person through a very thick skull, right? So just very superficially, that does not mean that the hands-on work done within the cranial model has no value for the patient. It has value. It probably has very consistent value or a consistent range or a reliable range of outcomes that the practitioner is able to identify. It's the ascription of meaning, right? So if you follow a cranial method or a cranial concept and you get what seems to be positive results with patients, you're probably getting positive results with patients. It's just not necessarily for the reason that you claim in interacting with the breath of life or the cerebrospinous fluids or the tides. It's probably not for those things. There's probably something else, another construct or another clearly identifiable thing that is not anything else that is occurring that has absolutely nothing to do with the concepts of tides or the concepts of the breath of life or palpating cerebrospinous fluid through a very thick skull and a living person who's laying on their back, and every time they take a breath, movement happens, right? So the confounds of the claims of the cranial methodology or craniosacral are really easy to pick up, but that doesn't mean that they are not producing consistent results that are identifiable within a consistent range by the practitioners and the patients that are performing these methods. So something is happening, just not the thing that is being claimed to happen, which then allows us to kind of circle back to this concept of faith. You have already had faith or confidence in something that is not you or someone that is not you, that comes before you, that shared information with you. You've had that faith. If we scratch at that, the claims, they're not as strong. So you are now working without what would be considered acceptable proof. Now you can then switch your focus to your observation of patients, your observation of outcomes, and their consistent range. You have to remove the ascription of meaning because you know that it is incorrect or that it's unreliable or that it's invalid. Now you have to start asking questions, or you would be well suited to start asking questions of what is happening when I do a visceral method or when I do a cranial method? What is consistently occurring, or what range of consistent results are occurring on some scale? So you have to now have faith that you can identify those things. What I've seen in many discussions, or what I've experienced in many discussions, is the claim that osteopathy can't be proven by science, or science can't prove osteopathy. We need a different method. We need something completely different. What I would say is that is a short-sighted concept. Science has already proven with some degree of validity and some degree of reliability that the claims of many osteopathic methods don't stand up to scrutiny. You're not doing what you claim you're doing. It doesn't mean you're doing nothing. You're just not doing what you claim you're doing. So now you may be well suited to have faith that you can observe what is occurring. You just may need a different construct. A construct essentially is something that can be identified as a unique thing. It may have some similarities to many other things, but is unique. It cannot be another thing. It is itself, and it is not another thing. So it's a somewhat vague way to say it. So it's like a can is a can. So let's just say you take a can of Coke or a can of pop or a can of soda, whichever term you prefer, branded or not. They're fairly standard in their volume, but they're different in their contents. They're different in their branding and what's on the outside of them. So a can of Coke is not a can of Pepsi. The can is the same dimensions. The mechanism to open it with a pull tab is the same. The materials are essentially the same, mostly aluminum. The manufacturing process for the can is the same. The contents are different. So a can of Coke is not a can of Pepsi. So the construct would be a can of Coke. But if we take out the contents, then the cans can be different based on what's on the outside of them. So hopefully that helps you understand a construct. An appropriate construct is something that is itself and is not anything else. It can be very similar to other things, but it's not. The way that that's going to inform the discussion around the progression of claims or knowledge in osteopathy, or in any profession for that matter, is to understand when your constructs have run out of steam, when they're not as useful as you would want them to be, and be willing to, in good faith, with observations that you don't currently have, believe that you can observe what's going on in a meaningful way and shift your attention to ask the simple question, what is happening? Have faith that you can identify what's happening within osteopathic treatments with some consistency, and move past the simple concept that, well, a treatment is individual to each patient. Yeah, that's absolutely true, but that doesn't mean that you can't set up an experiment to identify what happens with any given method with many, many different patients of high degrees of variability that do or don't have a condition that would be indicated for the particular treatment. You can set up experiments in order to appropriately examine that, but you have to have faith. You have to have the simple belief that you can identify what is occurring through appropriate observation. But if you continue to believe that it already is the thing that you say that it is, then you're not going to do that. You're actually acting in bad faith at that point, because you know, at least to some degree, that the claims of the osteopathic profession are not matching up to what is observable by external observation. So shifting the construct is probably the way to make, or I would predict that it's the strongest way to make osteopathy grow in its understanding of itself. Utilizing the older concepts, the older stories, the older explanations, the older mechanisms that don't quite stay up to observable patterns is not going to help. Shifting and having faith that we will find the pattern, that we can observe it, and we can generate appropriate methods to identify those things is probably going to benefit us all. So, with a bit of a meandering conversation, the central concept of which is the belief that something exists without being able to observe it directly, whether it's confidence in something that isn't you, that already exists or has been told to you, or confidence that something that you have never observed can be observed, right? We can work with that. And my hope is that as I go through this process, as I have these discussions on my own or with other people, we can engage some of these things and start to maybe point in a direction whereby we can have appropriate faith that we can identify what is consistently happening within osteopathic treatments, within osteopathic methods, within the range of outcomes for patients of osteopathic practitioners. And we can really start to build some momentum behind that, as opposed to simply trying to say that the methodology of scientific investigation, because realistically, science isn't necessarily a solid entity or a solid body of knowledge. It is a process of investigation, is the best way to broadly say it. That science can't test osteopathy, or science can't prove osteopathy, or whatever you want to say. Have faith that it is completely capable of doing it, but have faith that what we need to do is probably shift our attention or shift our willingness to ask certain types of questions. So with that, I will head out for now. I will say goodbye, but I will obviously continue to do these things, and I look forward to continuing these discussions, and hopefully you gain something from them.